This is an apologetic attempt to sidestep the data, what the plain meaning of the text is, and I don't think it works.
I want to thank Dan McClellan for his response to my video on Ezekiel 20, 25 through 26. Before I get into my response to his response, I want to establish some context for you guys. Dan believes that at one point, God commanded Israel to sacrifice their children to him, and Dan cites Exodus 22:29 as evidence of this. However, elsewhere in the Torah, it is explicitly stated that human firstborns are not to be sacrificed. Instead, they are to be redeemed, that is, substituted with a lamb. Exodus 22:29 is simply repeating that earlier law. As P. Inns writes, quote, "The law in Exodus 22:29 therefore is a reiteration of the one found earlier in Exodus, and we should assume that the passing reference here should be read in light of its fuller explication in chapter 13. Despite how Exodus clearly defines the meaning of this law, according to Dan, the secret original meaning of this law is that Israel was to sacrifice their firstborn children to the God of Israel. In order to support this interpretation, Dan departs from Exodus entirely and turns to Ezekiel 20, 25 through 26. Here, Ezekiel says that God gave Israel decrees that were not good, and according to Dan, these not good decrees are referring to the laws in Exodus 22:29, where God apparently commands Israel to sacrifice their firstborn children to him. In my video, I relied on the scholarship of Dr. Kelvin Freebill to demonstrate how Dan's interpretation of Ezekiel 20, 25 through 26 makes little sense exegetically. Go here to watch my video where I outline some of Freebill's arguments. In any case, Dan's interpretation fails because Ezekiel, within the same literary unit, distinguishes God's laws from these not good decrees in verse 25. For instance, among other things, Ezekiel uses the feminine plural chukot to describe God's laws, but in verse 25, he uses the masculine plural chukim and mishpatim to describe the not good decrees and regulations by which Israel could not live. From these and other textual data, it becomes apparent that the not good decrees in verse 25 should be understood as distinct from God's laws that he wanted his people to obey. So what are these not good decrees? Well, based on verse 23, where God vows to scatter Israel among the nations for their rejection of his laws, Freebill goes on to demonstrate that the not good decrees of verse 25 are better understood as God's decrees of judgment that were just mentioned. Again, see this video for the fuller argument. Now, I'd like to respond to Dan's objections to Freebill's paper. Here's what he says.
Now, the biggest problem with this argument is we do not have to go outside of Ezekiel chapter 20 to find the parallel to our masculine plural reference to legislation by which Israelites could not live. We just have to go to verse 18, because we have in verse 18 chukim in the masculine plural and mishpatim also in the masculine plural. And this is a reference to the laws of the Israelites' fathers and ancestors. So basically, that law that I gave you, I'm going to slap another layer onto it, and it's going to be legislation that your ancestors followed, basically requiring you to go sacrifice your children. And that is how I am going to defile you. That's how you're not going to be able to live. And that's how I'm going to show you who's boss. So the article this creator cites overlooks the clearest and the closest parallel to what's going on in verse 25 in favor of going outside of the chapter.
Okay, so first, it's not accurate to say that Freebill goes outside of the chapter to establish the meaning of the not good decrees mentioned in Ezekiel 20:25. Freebill's interpretation is based on verse 23, just 2 verses earlier. As I noted in my video, in Hebrew, there is a structural connection between verses 23 and 25. Both begin with I also. Freebill demonstrates how this is a literary device that signifies a continuation of the subject introduced in verse 23, where God vows to send the people into exile as judgment. Thus, verse 25 refers to God's judgments. Freebill turns to the parallel in chapter 5 as just another example of this. It is also not true to say that Freebill overlooks verse 18. In reality, Freebill cites this exact verse as support for his interpretation. interpretation. Freebell notes that whenever the masculine plural chukim is used in this chapter, it is in a place that is not referring to God's commandments, including in verse 18. And that is Freebell's exact point concerning verse 25. The not good decrees of verse 25 are not God's commandments. Ezekiel deliberately makes a distinction between God's life-giving laws that he wants his people to obey and things that are not God's laws, and verse 18 further illustrates this distinction. So again, Freebell does not overlook this verse. In any case, Dan's argument is basically that we should interpret verse 25 in light of verse 18. Verse 18 says that Israel's ancestors turned away from God. Instead of following the life-giving commands that God gave them, they rebelled against God's commands and started following their own practices and regulations, as we see in verse 18. Dan argues that since the next generation of Israel continued to rebel, God gave them the same wicked laws, which included child sacrifice. And why did God do this? Basically, according to Dan, it was to bully Israel, to, quote, show them who's boss. Dan insists that this is the, quote, plain reading of the text. But is that really the plain reading of the text? Not really. Dan is reading his own dogma into the text. Throughout Ezekiel 20, God is condemning the Israelites for disobeying him. Verse 23 says that he swore to scatter them among the nations, and verse 25 says that he gave them decrees that were not good. The natural flow of the text makes it clear that verse 25 refers back to the decree of judgment mentioned just 2 verses earlier. The plain reading of the text is that the way God devastated Israel and showed them that he is the Lord was by allowing Babylon to destroy them and take them into exile. Ezekiel wasn't talking about some imaginary commands about child sacrifice that are never mentioned anywhere else in the scriptures. He is talking about the punishment of exile. That is evident throughout chapter 20, but especially when you consider that verse 23 declares that Israel is being punished with exile, and verse 34 declares that this same punishment will be removed. It says, "I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you out from the countries where you are scattered." Notice that it does not say, "I will stop commanding you to sacrifice your children." When you simply read the text for what it says, it is pretty plain that God's punishment upon Israel for their disobedience was exile, not the imposition of human sacrifice rituals. Unfortunately, Dan ignores the immediate context and leaves Ezekiel altogether to try to find support for his interpretation. He turns to Exodus 22:29 and assumes that this verse was written prior to all the other passages in Exodus that explain what it means to offer your firstborn. Dan's theory relies solely on this single verse, and he completely disregards all other verses in Exodus that explain the meaning of this commandment. Then he takes his unreasonable interpretation of Exodus 22:29 and reads it into Ezekiel 20:25. A better approach, as Freebell has argued, is to simply interpret Ezekiel 20:25 within its context. Again, the immediate context reveals that God's not good decrees refer to his decrees of judgment upon Israel that were mentioned just 2 verses earlier. Another problem with Dan's argument is that it makes no sense. Throughout the chapter, God is complaining about Israel disobeying him and defiling themselves, which included sacrificing their children. So, as a punishment, God is going to give them bad commandments to sacrifice their children? If God wanted Israel to stop defiling themselves, why would he give them commandments that would cause them to defile themselves more? And why would Israel want to obey God if their obedience brought destruction upon them? Whether they obeyed or disobeyed, the result would be the same. Now, Dan might be fine with these logical problems, but in my opinion, his interpretation does not follow the natural flow of the text. Finally, Dan's argument is inconsistent with the rest of Ezekiel. Ezekiel portrays God as someone who wants his people to be righteous and live. Chapter 20 says much the same thing, that as much as Israel will know that he is the Lord when he does punish them for their sins, they will really know that he is the Lord when he shows mercy upon them. Does that sound like someone who wants to bully his people and put them into no-win situations? Dan's interpretation presents an inconsistent and inaccurate picture of who Ezekiel says the Lord is. Now again, Dan might be fine with these inconsistencies that his interpretation creates, but one thing is for sure, his interpretation is not a plain reading of the text. Once again, if you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend Freebell's paper. As we've seen, I think Dan's objections fail to convince, and Freebell, I think, offers a better approach to this passage in Ezekiel. I hope you guys find this helpful. Hey everyone, thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to see more content like this, I want to invite you to subscribe to my channel. Also, don't forget to hit that little bell so that you'll be notified when new videos like this are released. One last thing, be sure to connect with me on my website, davidwilber.com. There you can find a ton of free resources like articles and videos. You can learn more about the books that I've written. Also, if God has put it on your heart, there is an opportunity to throw a couple bucks my way to support my work. Again, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.